Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sue Staunton, and I'd like to welcome you to the James Cowper Kreston webinar on spin-outs for technology companies. With me today is my partner, Sharon Bedford, who specialises in advising spin-out companies and their stakeholders on tax issues. Spin-outs are a particular specialism of the firm, and we're currently acting for some 100 such businesses at various stages of their development. And our spin-out is the incorporation of a company which commercialises intellectual property developed in another entity, typically a research institution or a university. There are increasing numbers of such companies being set up, and it's an exciting as well as challenging time to be involved in the generation of one. I think it's also true to say that compared with the research base in each country, we're currently outstripping the US in terms of numbers of spin-outs that are being developed. During our session today, we'll be considering some of the many issues that typically arise during the spin-out process and immediately after, and highlight some of the pitfalls to avoid. So we'll be looking at planning for a spin-out, the key tax considerations for founders and investors, getting the investment in, post-spin-out, key things to do, R&D tax credits, and then issues to watch for. In the time available that we've got today, we won't be able to cover everything, but we're always happy to have a chat if you have any specific queries, or to have email correspondence with you in relation to that. So firstly then, planning for a spin-out, key requirements. The key requirements, I think, primarily, of course, involve a really great technology that has a clear commercial opportunity. There are many times, and you may well have seen it yourselves, where people have got what they consider to be a great technology, but actually there's no real particular commercial application for it. And one of the issues that we sometimes have is discussions with potential founding academics about the technologies they've got and trying to seek where the market opportunity might be for that. What we try and do is to ensure that people start from the premise of there is a market need, and therefore this is what our technology could do to solve it. Second, and a very close second to the importance of a great technology, is a good team to take the idea forward. Because investors aren't interested in investing in somebody who's necessarily just got a good idea. They need somebody who who, with a team around them, can actually commercialise that and move forward from the position of being in the institution or the university. Then we need to have investors and the right support infrastructure. Most technology-based businesses are very capital intensive. And although a little bit can be done on a shoestring and bootstrapping, perhaps by the founders doing some consultancy work or something like that, the days of being able to do that on a large scale have largely disappeared. And what we're seeing now is a need to get companies off the ground much more quickly than they used to be able to be done, and therefore a higher need for much larger round of investment at that first stage. And finally, then, I think you need a very clear business plan that can articulate for yourself as a potential founder, as well as to potential stakeholders such as investors, key milestones that will be achieved and the funding that will be required in order to deliver those particular milestones. So a business plan, and if we look at that again needs to demonstrate the clear commercial application for the technology and the scope of the market. Perhaps looking at competitors who are already in the field, even if they may be slightly different to yourself in terms of what they're offering. Nonetheless, it's important to understand the scale of the overall market. So it could be, for example, if you are developing a diabetes therapy, that you look overall at globally in a number of people who suffer from diabetes and the number of different types of treatments, whether that's vaccinations or or drugs or other sorts of aligned therapies when you're trying to assess the size of your particular market. You then need to have a step plan to get to commercialisation. So how long is it going to take you? If you need to go through particular trial protocols, which would differ in terms of scale, whether you've got a drug or medical device, or alternatively, if you have got a physical science derived technology, then important to work out how many stages, what you need to do in order to be able to get this to the market. It's also worth thinking about in a business plan or articulating other opportunities there might be to monetize the technology, for example, through joint ventures or licensing, and consider how the ultimate product might be sold. We're seeing an increasing number of companies that have platform technologies that perhaps they will only be able to afford to develop a couple of applications for within their own company. But nonetheless, they could actually license out the technology to somebody else to utilise in a different technology, in a different application, or indeed, or in a different geographic territory. So it's worth thinking about those sorts of opportunities, because that then means that the company itself can derive the maximum benefit from the technology itself. Within the business plan, and I mentioned earlier the importance of the management team, it's important to demonstrate the strength of the management team, including their commercial experience as well as their technological experience. We see a number of times where people will bring in, perhaps as non-executives, those people who've taken a company from a very early stage right the way through, perhaps to an IPO, or who have particular experience within the industry and are well regarded for that. And adding those sorts of names to the business plan is very compelling for future investors. Then it's important to identify how much funding is required, perhaps both an estimation throughout the lifespan of the company until it gets to a commercializable state, and then break that down into the different stages that each level of funding would get the company to. But Sharon, quite apart from all the commercial considerations, there are a large number of tax issues, aren't there, that those spinning out a company should think about?
Yes, Sue, that's right. And in particular, I think it's worth touching on two here in a little bit more detail. The first being academic relief, which is important for the founders, and then secondly, the Enterprise Investment Scheme, known as EIS, and potentially other reliefs that are available for investors and spin-outs. So starting with academic relief then, it's probably worth just thinking about the particular tax issue that academic relief is looking to address. So in broad general terms, if any present, prospective or past director or an employee acquires shares in a company because of their employment, then they are in the employment related security rules. And if they pay less than market value for those shares, i.e. an undervalue, then they are liable to income tax and in some cases national insurance on the difference. There can also be income tax and national insurance charges if certain events happen post-acquisition which increases the value of the shares. So the big concern here is that if academics got shares by virtue of the employment with the research institution, or if they're going to move with the spin-out company, they could suffer quite a substantial income tax charge. That's because they potentially and quite commonly pay less than the seed investors do. When these rules have been around for a long time now, they were introduced back in 2003, and when they were originally enacted, they actually led to a temporary stop in spin-out activity. And so sort of tax advisors and some research institutions, etc., went back to the government, and the result was this academic relief, which I'm going to talk about now. So in the summary of the relief, what the relief allows is that when looking at the value of the shares that the academics obtain, then you can ignore the effect of any transfer of IP or any other IP agreements, such as the license of IP, from the research institution. IP is very widely defined in these circumstances. It's not just patents, but it includes, for example, know-how and other such things. So in order to fall within the exemption, the academic must have been involved in researching the IP that is subject to the IP agreement at the research institution. And the shares that he or she acquires in the spin-out must be either before the IP agreement is entered into or within 183 days after. So if you think about the value that an initial spin-out often has, then it really is the IP and the value of the type P that drives the value of the shares in the company. And therefore, if you can ignore that on the valuation, that means that typically the shares are worth considerably less, and this potential income tax charge doesn't arise on the academics. There are a few possible issues that need to be, that need to be looked out for though when you are looking at academic relief, and I've just jotted a few down there. Sometimes the rules can be quite complicated if there's collaborations between research institutions and that IP is involved in the spin out. And that's something we've been quite successful at going to HMRC to get some guidance on, and to make sure that the relevant academics can rely on the reliefs. Spin outs where there are no IP transfers are also need a little bit more further thought. It's also worth making the point that these rules only really apply to academics who've worked on the IP, and where the non-academic founders really have to think about other things that you could possibly do. And for instance, share options, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, might be a possibility there. But of course, academics are not only the parties involved. For a spin-out to occur, you also need investors, and some of these investors may be looking at tax advantageous reliefs, such as EIS. The next slide here lists out the tax advantages that are available to EIS, and also seed EIS, which is a type of EIS available for much smaller investments in much smaller companies. I'm not going to go through those in detail now because of the time involved, but needless to say, the big two advantages are the investors get some sort of income tax relief up front on investing in the shares, and so long as they hold the shares for 3 years, then typically they can sell them without paying any tax. Some red flags though, and some things to watch out for if you do have investors who want to get EIS in a spin out. Firstly, HMRC are requiring more and more detail on the proposed spending and the proposed plans before they will grant EIS status to a company. Sue was mentioning earlier the need for a good business plan, and HMRC really want to see this, as well as detailed cash forecasts on how the money that is being raised will be spent. It is possible to go to HMRC before the investment for their sort of advanced assurance that EIS or SEIS will apply. But just be aware, this can be time consuming. Sometimes it can take 6 to 8 weeks to get a reply. And as some investors will insist on that advanced assurance, you need to think early about getting those that process underway at an early stage in the spin out. If you do get EIS or SEIS, you need to keep a watchful eye for 3 years post-investment. There are things that happen with the company, things that they can do that would invalidate the EIS, and typically the funds or the angel investors that have relied on it don't really like that. Things that need to watch out for especially are any joint ventures you might enter into, or any changes to the share structure of the company. We're often asked whether the founders or other people coming into the management team can get EIS and SEIS. The rules here are very complicated. However, and that's something that we can advise on an individual case and on an individual basis. That being said though, it is worth saying that HMRC do expect the investors to invest significant amounts from their own resources, really, in order to qualify. So, a couple of areas to watch out therefore on tax at the start of the spin out. But of course, having been through many of the tax and commercial issues, you have to come to actually getting the spin out done. So what happens next, Sue?
Well, the first thing really is to get the investment in, and that may be very quick, depending on if you've got people already lined up who are interested in the technology and taking the company further, or it could take quite a while. And we've certainly seen a couple of spin-outs where it's taken 18 months to 2 years to actually get the funding in. And that can be for all sorts of reasons. It could be wrong timing in terms of the general market conditions. It could be wrong timing in terms of the sorts of investors who you wish to attract, because perhaps they're fully expended in terms of their particular portfolios. So, or it could just be that there's not much interest in the area of technology that the company is purporting to be involved in. So this sort of stage can be short or long. What we recommend is that you in pitching for investment, you do a lot of PRs, a lot of noise around the sorts of area that you're going to be involved in. You attend as many conferences and pitch events as possible. There are lots and lots of pitch events, both throughout the UK and more widely on a global basis, where people can turn up and pitch their particular idea. It may well just be I've had some clients who've just done 5-minute pitches at a number of events, but have secured funding as a result of that, because they've got some interest in their product or their technology from the investors. Slightly more sort of work, I think, is finding the right investors. Part of that is about getting introductions from people who are already in the marketplace, perhaps accountants, lawyers who've worked with particular investors, or indeed other people who have spun out companies successfully. Getting introductions is a great way of getting involved with those with investors, because it's a much better than a warm lead. If you're emailing investors, then your chances of success in terms of them picking up the phone to you or getting engaged with you are relatively low, simply because of the volume of interested parties that they get with people pitching for investment. I would recommend quite a lot of research to see who's investing in your sector, who perhaps has exited recently well from something in your sector, because then they'll have some more money to invest. And looking at how mature their funds are. So would definitely recommend looking at the VCT website, Venture Capital Trust websites, and just getting as much information as you possibly can from various people. Once you've got investors, maybe one or maybe several investors who are interested in putting the money into the company, then you're into the negotiations about what stake they might get, so what equity split you've got. And during all that, you've got to bear in mind that if you're going to need further rounds of investment, then dilution is going to continue, and you want to just sort of keep a weathered eye on where you as the founders perhaps might end up in terms of your potential stake within the company. Also, you'll start drafting investor agreements, which can cover all sorts of things, so including what you might need investor consent to do, what company decisions can only be taken if you have full investor consent, who's got the right to appoint directors, who can be a director, and who actually has control, because the fact that somebody perhaps owns 20% of the company doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have control of the company, because provisions can be written within the investor agreement to enable them to have control. Something to watch out for are the information requirements, and we see this quite a lot with investors, that with all the excitement of doing the spin out, founders don't always see what they are required to do in terms of keeping investors up to date. And whilst everything's fine when the relationship is good, occasionally, if you've not been providing information as they've required and what they've required, then they could use that as a trigger point to take action against the company if they're not feeling, that they want to still be involved with the company. So I think that's something just to bear in mind. One of the other things that starts to be looked at this stage and will typically be enshrined in the investor agreements and documentation at spin-out are share options, which are a great way of rewarding employees. And Sharon, you referred to that earlier. Do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Share options are incredibly common and popular in technology spin-outs. In fact, quite a lot of the investors will insist that they're put in place because they want employee engagement. And indeed, I think most spin-outs will be probably a competitive advantage when it comes to recruitment if they don't have them. Of all the types of different option schemes that are available, EMI options tend to be the first choice for spin-out companies. They typically are available for most smaller companies, and they have lots of tax advantages. So generally there's no tax charge on the grant or exercise of the option, and under current rules anyway, if the option holder is still an employee when they eventually get some money against their option, then the tax charge will only be 10%. It is important though to plan the options, to think through what the terms of the options should be, who they should be given to, when they should vest, etc. And make sure that that's planned properly, both to meet the tax rules but also commercially to work for the company. It's typical and normal that the valuation of the share options is agreed with HMRC at the time of them putting in. And just a word of warning there, HMRC have recently got a lot more aggressive of how they look at the valuation of the options for early stage tech companies, and we're not seeing quite as low valuations agreed with them as was otherwise the case in the past. So I guess the rule there is make sure you think about your options sooner rather than later. EMI isn't always possible, and there are alternatives. Again, I'm not going to go into detail now, but if EMI doesn't work for your spin out and you want to look at other things, then clearly we'd be happy to talk. But typically share options are put in place just after the investment, and there's some other things that also have to take place post spin out, isn't there, Sue?
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that's sort of to some extent the fun and exciting part of the process. You've got your money in, you've got all the documentation written up, and what do you do now? And of course, that's all about getting going. And some of the getting going obviously involves thinking through how you're going to structure the business. May well be, as with many spin-outs, that you're going to be a lean spin-out, so you don't need much office space, and you outsource much of your activity perhaps back into the research institution that you've spun out of. Or alternatively, you might have sufficient funding to enable you to set up a full-scale laboratory and office facility. So you've having worked that out, you then need to sign up on secure leases, perhaps do fit out if you're needing lab space and you haven't. The facilities don't actually already have the lab space built in. And of course, all that involves spending money. So you then need to set up all the basics around the accounting and payroll and registering for VAT and so on to make sure that you're looking after the money effectively. So you're not just going after the most exciting looking centrifuge, but you're sort of looking at spending what's actually in your budget, and you're measuring that against that budget for your investor purposes. Setting up contracts with suppliers, thinking about your IP strategy may well be worth being involved, getting IP agents appointed so that you can talk through what the best way of protecting your technology might be, where you need to protect it, because it can be very expensive to take patents out globally, and where are the key areas that you need to think about. Also need to think about, if you've got employees, you're going to need to get into having HR policy, employment contracts, staff handbooks, And then all the basic governance behind that that enables you to operate a company, so health and safety, processes and procedures and staff handbooks. So some of that is very exciting, getting the lab set up, perhaps all the office space set up, and actually getting going with the research. But some of it might seem to be a little bit more pedestrian, such as the doing some of the legal stuff and setting up the accounting, but nonetheless important. But one of the most important things I think to remember about that, not getting that right, can lead you into some difficult problems. And certainly I've encountered that a few years ago with a company that came to us. It'd been running for a few years. They'd got an offer for 12 million for their sale on the table. And we're going into due diligence, and they wanted a hand-holding during the DD process. They ended up in a position where they didn't sell the business, and it ended up in liquidation, and the intellectual property disappeared entirely. And the reason that happened was that during due diligence it became very apparent that their books and accounts were really fairly minimal, to put it mildly. They'd been using the company very much as a personal piggy bank for the two founding parties. And although everything was sort of above board, it didn't look as if it necessarily was. And they'd also treated the intellectual property in very much the same way. So it wasn't clear where the IP actually was owned. So it was apparently part owned between founders and the company, because somebody had advised them at some point that was the best thing to do. Because of all that confusion, the purchasers just walked away because they couldn't be clear what they were actually buying. So that's sort of a slight word of warning. But on a more positive note, I think one of the most useful things that we've seen companies being able to access post spin out is that of research and development tax credits, which you do a lot of work on, Sharon, don't you?
Yes, we do. They're sort of it's always quite refreshing to talk to spin outs about R&D tax credits, because it's not the paying out of money but the receiving back of money. Just in a nutshell, R&D tax credits are available for qualifying research which seeks an advance in science or technology. So almost by their very definition, most spin-outs would carry out qualifying R&D. And therefore the work that we do with them is helping them to articulate what they're doing in a way that HMRC can appreciate and understand, and also look at the financials to make sure that they are maximising the claim. What an R&D tax credits deliver is they deliver cash back for companies that are not yet in a tax paying situation. So most spin outs will be claiming cash back under this scheme for the first few years of their existence at least. And that's claimed by the annual corporation tax return. A few issues just to watch out for on R&D. One is there are some strange rules about how they interact with grants or other funded collaborations. So if you are in that position, then please take advice as to the interaction and what that will mean for your R&D tax credits and your overall cash flow. And secondly, R&D tax credits in the best sense, and the ones that pay back the most money, are only available for small and medium-sized enterprises. And where you might think, well, I'm a startup company and therefore, of course I'm small, that isn't always the case. It can be sometimes, depending on who invests in you and the percentage of shareholdings that they have, that can also cause some issues sometimes. So again, worth getting advice early. And just to remember, there are some nasty sort of consultation documents floating around at the moment from the government, where they might be putting some caps on R&D tax credits related to the company's PAYE. We don't know what's happening on that yet, but it is worth, again, taking advice. That's effectively going to affect spin-outs where they don't have many employees and most of their R&D is subcontracted, for instance, back to the research institution of which they spun out from. There are some other issues to watch out for as well, aren't there, Sue?
Yes, no, absolutely. And yeah, that's around as the company starts to mature. It's about whether you enter into agreements, whether you employ people or contractors, whether and more widely international issues. So if you are engaged abroad, as most tech companies will be, because the marketplace is a global one rather than necessarily a local one, and also financial governance on a slightly broader spectrum.
Yeah, and one of the things that is particularly you need to watch out for, and again, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I've jotted some thoughts down on the slides, are where you have what's known as off-payroll workers. So directors who you're not paying through the payroll. This is quite common, but actually HMRC are getting more and more. Certainly, if they look at this, their stance is very much that all directors should be paid through a payroll, including non-executive directors. So something that needs to be watched out for. And also there are some new rules. I think everyone's heard of IR35 and contractors that are paid through limited companies. There are also some changes coming in scheduled from April next year. Again, typically where you have spin-outs who employ technical consultants, etc., they will need to monitor and be aware of those rules. There's also one of the things I get spend a lot of my time talking to spin-outs on is international tax matters. I think as a sector, companies that have spun out tend to go international much more quickly than normally is the case, and I'm sure everyone will appreciate that creates all sorts of potential overseas tax issues that need to be aware of. I've jotted down on the slides there some of the triggers where you might need to start thinking about your cross-border tax, hiring overseas employees, doing overseas clinical trials, selling or licensing your technology overseas, and there are many more. And of course, you also need to be sort of Brexit ready.
And then I think one of the other critical things which we talked about earlier was financial governance. It's important not just because of your investors and keeping them up to date and making sure that they're comfortable, but it can be very important for regulatory purposes, including clinical trials, because you have to have that documentation around all of your processes and controls. It's also important to make sure that you're using your cash effectively. We've seen examples at early stages where there haven't been controls perhaps exerted by investors, and inexperienced directors, perhaps they've just come straight out of academia, have not quite understood what being the responsibilities of being a company director are about, and have suddenly thought that having a company bank account means that you can charge lots of things to expenses that more conventionally are not charged. And I remember one of my staff coming to see me asking whether it was normal for somebody to have 3 pints of lager that they charged the company on the journey between Paddington and Didcot. But I think it's those sorts of things are really important to have established good controls, so that then when you come to a future exit or potentially a flotation, as many companies within the sector will look for a float, that you don't have any hiccups as regards any of the investigative accounting work that has to be carried out around those sorts of processes, and the due diligence runs through smoothly, and the questions that you're asked are actually of a more elevated nature than why you allowed somebody to have 3 pints of lager on the company's account on a shortish train journey. So we've had to canter through quite quickly, I think, on some of the issues this afternoon that face spin-outs and early spin-out, post-spin-out companies. We have got more details in our technology guide, Spin-outs to Exit, and we'll mail links to those around. We don't have any questions that anybody's posed to date, but please do feel free to get in touch with either Sharon or myself if you've got any queries going forward about the topics that we've talked about today. Thank you for your time.